you confirm that you love university?
Yes. I just doing that.
Sure.
Yes, doing that.
This one just confirm that it's happening.
It is happening.
Okay. Okay.
I used to volunteer at an adoption center when I was in high school. During my time there, I think it was one of the best times of my life because it was very nice to see how cheerful these orphans are when they see other people come in and spread their joy, etc. But beneath all that happiness, you can see this one pain in them. The pain that they never had what I had. They never have a family to rely on. They never have siblings for you to play with, or something to call mine. This main problem is caused by one thing, is that they know that they don't look like the people who are about to adopt them. And that is why they're not being chosen, and they're not chosen into this family to begin with. This is something that they're reminded of every single day. And that is something that we want to change on Psychology. In my speech, I'll talk about 4 things. First, I'll tell you what is the main problem with adoption in status quo, and what are the types of target people that are intended to target. Second, I'll talk to you about, is changing this appearance, physical appearance of the child, really a problem, and is it against their will, etc. Then I'll talk to you about the concept of parenthood, and what is parenthood, and how do we then go on from there. And last but not least is how do we help this adopted child to accept himself into this new family. First thing, what is the main problem with adoption in status quo? We tell you that people who go for adoption, people who choose them, will be people who can't conceive, or people who just don't want to conceive. But the reason why they would not go for adoption and then opt for other methods such as IVF and etc. is for 2 reasons. One is the idea of conception, and second is the idea of lineage. The idea of conception is that you want a child that looks like you, and you want to be involved in the process of making a child, where you would want to have, you want to go through the pain of childbirth. Sit down. You want to go through the experience of waking up at 3 in the morning and feeding a child. These are the forms of conception that exist. Lineage would be having a child with the same hereditary features, etc. And these are the problems that exist with adoption itself. Even if IVF is super expensive, people still choose that because these are the problems we have with this as a whole. The aim of side government is this. At the very best, we want to narrow the gap between actual childbirth and also adoption. Because conceive, we can't make it as the exact same thing, but at least we'll narrow the gap and make it as close as possible to you actually producing a child, where this baby looks like you and talks like you, and then we'll go on from there. The idea of conception. Sit down. So what are the types of people that we're targeting? We recognize that yes, there are 2 types of people in the world. You have your philanthropists that will want to adopt regardless. Your Angelina Jolie, they want to adopt 10 children regardless of how they look, the color of the skin, or whatever facial features they are. These types of people are not in the debate because they will do it regardless. The types of people that we want to focus on are people who want to adopt, but then they have this problem that this child doesn't look like them, and they want to be involved in this process of creating this baby and making this baby part of theirs, which is similar to childbirth. This is target group in this side of the debate. The trade-off of this, and this is something that side opposition has to engage with. Even if the possibility that this child is morphed in a way that they look dominant in a way, or even worst case scenario, they change the someone who's black to a child that is white. We think even if that happens, as long as the outcome this child actually gets a family that cares about him, and the child gets adopted, we think that is fine in our side because that is the trade-off that we are willing to go. Right? Third thing, is changing the appearance of the child really a bad thing? Sit down. Because we foresee this argument that it's against the child's will and against the concept of the child is going to look like someone who's completely different than what he's born to be. We would argue primarily that children more often don't really have a choice, especially when it comes to appearance itself. Because you have to look at the comparative. When it comes to appearance, is the lottery of birth, where the child is born with a certain facial features, a certain maybe even disabilities. So that is something that's determined by the birth lottery. But the problem with the birth lottery on the other side is that it affects this. The consequence of that is that it affects this child and makes him not be able to be adopted into the family because people want the child that looks like that. Right? So at least on the other side, if it's not, we are okay with parents playing God and parents being the ones who replace birth lottery instead and determine how the child looks. As long as there's a tangible benefit that the child gets adopted, we think that is perfectly fine, right? Before I go on to the concept of parenthood,
Okay, sure. At what age do you tell the children that they've been changed radically from their original appearance?
We think the choice of telling your child whether or not it's been changed is similar to the choice of telling your child it is adopted. We think it's perfectly fine to the parent, even if he wants to say it or not, because in the idea of parenthood. But I'll talk more about that in the fourth argument of how this child can move on better. We think the conclusion to the changing of parents, we think so long as these parents don't put an undue burden on this child in changing him so much that it affects his health, his life, etc. We think that is perfectly fine. In those instances, the state can always step in. We think that should be the yardstick in interfering. Let's talk about the concept of parenthood. Two levels to this. We think when you are a parent and you want to have a child, more like at the very best, you want this child to be an extension of you, where you want this child to have your values, your norms. You want this child to have your religion. You want this child to go to proper schools. Even if you don't want this child to have what you have, you would want this child to have more than what you have, because that is the concept of parenthood, right? All of this is done for the simple reason of relatability. You want to be able to relate to your child as much as possible, which is why if you're a huge fan of soccer, you would send your child to play soccer, and then you can relate and tell your friends, that is my son out there playing soccer and scoring goals. That is something that relatability can exist when it comes to other forms of features. But when it comes to physical features, this is a relatability that cannot exist. Because even if it is merely by the happiness of bonding with your child, when you look at your child and see yourself in the child, even if it's not other things, but merely by physical appearance, at least we get to give this parent that form of idea, right? Because the concept of parenthood will not exist if these parents are too few if these parents look at physical appearance, the differences in it too much, right? We think that is something that we can teach you. But fourthly, let's talk about how we better help this child accept himself. Because similar to the POI that was asked, whether or not this child knows if adopted or not will be an issue. But we tell you, like at the very least, even if your parents don't tell you, if your parents tell you and you can't accept it, at least you can relate to your parents or your immediate family members because you grew up with them. But you'll never be able to relate to your extended family members, be your cousin, etc. Because the only thing that bonds you with them is this blood connection. So the moment that you know that you're not one of them, or at the very least do not look at them and look like them, and then you will never have this form of connection with extended family members, right? But we tell you, at least we help parents who do not want to tell their children that they're adopted. Because let's face it, the moment children know they are adopted, they more often have a distant connection with their parents themselves. And under the other side, if you choose to adopt a black child and you're white, you have to tell your child at one point in time, look, you're adopted. At least under our child, if you get to change his physical appearance, you don't have to go through that phase in life where this child is completely distant from his parents solely because of the fact that you're adopted. We think at the very least, our case has no harms at all. Because all we do is narrow the gap between adoption and natural birth. And I think that is something that this house should encourage and agree with. Yeah.
So, what exactly will you change about these newborns? Because when you're a newborn baby, you have no idea how tall the baby is going to be, how athletic the baby is going to be, how clever the baby is going to be. The only thing that you can change about a newborn's appearance, shape of the eyes, shape of the nose, skin color. And the implications of which are that the primary reason why you want to change the appearance of a baby is because you want to change the racial appearance of the baby. Change skin from black to white, to change your flower nose of a Malay boy into the sharp nose of a Chinese person, your mother setback into the eyes of a white person. These are the sort of things that you are going to change under the policy. And I'm telling you that this is extremely bad for the child and extremely bad for the community. But one point of rebuttal before I move on into substantive, right? The issue with the birth lottery. The problem is not with the birth lottery. The problem is with how we determine what is valuable about the lot that you've been given in life. Right? It is one thing to suggest that some of you may be born black, some of you may be born white, and some of you may be born Hispanic. But it is quite another thing to make judgments and to facilitate arbitrary judgments about the race, the worth of a person's race. That is to say, when you say, you know, we really don't think it's right for us to be able to raise a black kid because we don't value the fact, we don't value the race that you were born with, we want to change that part of you. That is something that's fundamentally discriminatory. That is precisely the problem with the lottery. Not the lottery itself, but the way you choose to treat the results of the lottery, that matters. No, thank you. Our policy is going to be simple. We are fine with pumping more money into the adoption system so that kids in orphanages can be better taken care of. If it means hiring more social workers to get more attention, if it means encouraging adoption through other means, for example, the provision of subsidies or tax breaks, we are perfectly willing to do so. But why is it that we're not willing to take the step of allowing parents to change the racial appearance of their newborn kids? First point, what's best for the child? I think that when the first speaker of the government says that, oh, you know, parental love should not have to be beholden to one's appearances, we completely agree, right? We think that parents should love their children for who they are, rather than using the children as a vehicle to realize their own particular aspirations, right? When you look at a child in an adoption center or in an orphanage, when you feel that instinctive connection with a particular child, you fall in love with that particular child, not the child who you want him or her to be. And therefore, we don't want children to become programmable robots that can be shaped according to your own whims and fancies, because a child is a child. And don't tell me this nonsense about children never finding out that they're adopted, because many kids, millions of kids, eventually find out through adoption certificates or things like that they are eventually adopted. When the entire country finds out that you have instituted a policy that allows for the conversion of thousands of black babies to white babies, some of your white adopted kids who are formerly black are going to ask themselves, was I originally black? No, thank you. The doubt is going to remain, the research is going to continue, and many of them are going to find out one way or another that they were indeed adopted and that they had their identities changed. So the implication then is, who are you to hide their identity from them, right? Who are you, like, even in the status quo, who are you to hide the identity of their adoption from these kids? And in your policy, it's going to be even worse. You are literally lying to your children. Who are you to deny them a fundamental aspect of their identity? You talk about the birth lottery, but you are denying these kids a chance to access the unique identity and culture of a minority community from the very beginning. You are using children as a vehicle for your own convenience. And frankly, what happens if your child's appearance continues to change throughout his life or her life, even after the initial surgery? That means that the game is up, right? In many instances, it means that the child's welfare is being compromised because the child is no longer seen as someone that the parent unconditionally loves. The child has been lied to, their choices have been deprived because they no longer access the identity that they could have access to before, and this is something that we cannot ever stand for. No, thank you. But the equally important thing I want to talk about is the second argument. What's best for the community? So I think it's fairly obvious that the sort of people who will be doing the adopting are those who are socioeconomically well off. Your white majorities in America, for instance. The sort of people who you end up adopting are those that have the social economically disadvantaged, which is why they generally are in these situations that they are in right now. Your black kids, your Hispanic kids. So what happens to black and Hispanic communities? What happens to minority communities? Why is it that white parents somehow feel the compulsion to change the racial appearance of their children? So at worst, it's because they are racist, and obviously we don't want to condone that sort of behavior. But at best, I'll be charitable and say, oh, you might face discrimination in the community, and that's why you want to change your appearance so that they don't have to deal with that sort of thing. So in the name of sympathy, in the name of trying to prevent discrimination against these kids, you are going to exclude kids of a certain racial group from your communities, from your neighborhoods, from your schools, and that is a rhetoric that you're going to send out to the rest of society. Yes, we're excluding you from our schools because, it's in your best interest, because otherwise you discriminate against. That's just another goddamn excuse for segregation, and we cannot stand for that, right? You are essentially going to racialize neighborhoods completely, and that's not something we can defend. Yes?
So the way we assess how we perceive certain race are still going to exist under your side. The difference is people actively show it when they choose not to adopt a certain kid because of certain race. How do you change everything?
Damn right you are. They do show it the status quo. But we see that we see a trend of more interracial marriages taking place. We see change happening slowly in the long run. My question to you, therefore, is when you talk about the trade-offs, will you in your interest of trying to defend the short term of allowing a limited number of children to be able to access these particular racial neighborhoods, you are sacrificing the entire long term because you're sending off the message that one entire racial group is not going to be included in your community. You talk about protecting children. Millions of black children have already been born who are already facing discrimination, and you are making it actively worse because you are allowing white parents to say, we don't really want black kids in our community. So what are the implications for the national conversation on racism? You are retarding the progress of anti-racism efforts because you are allowing racist white parents to express their preferences, or even for white parents who are afraid of discrimination, you are giving them the easy way out, the coward's way out, the prisoner's dilemma, the exit strategy that allows them to do what's in their individual best interest but sacrificing the entire communal interest in the process. You are creating the same sort of lost generation that the Australian Aborigines suffered from because you are literally taking kids away from their racial communities and trying to change their culture and change their way of life and pretend that their original identities never existed. And if you want to talk about the angle of international adoptions, for instance, what happens then? You're not merely compromising the minority communities in your own country. You are actively whitewashing the history of people who are born and adopted from countries like Malawi and so on, and China and so on and so forth. These are the sort of things we cannot stand for. We are literally creating a culture of white man's burden. They say they are in favor of protecting children. We tell you that if you want to protect the millions of children who are already born to different communities, you have to change societal perceptions as a whole. This policy is making things worse. Go to opposition.
Opposition to that speech. Now this debate is not about racism, because although skin color might be a part of how we choose who to adopt, there are also things like just changing facial features, right? So that's a part of the debate that maybe you want to consider to talk about. But I'll engage with that premise that suppose race is a big issue. Suppose racism is a problem. I mean, it is a problem that we need to combat. Are we using, or is it okay for us to say, to take away the chance of a child to be adopted in hope of an ambiguous social change that there's no guarantee will happen anyway? At least the tangible benefit of you being adopted is right now, and that's guaranteed. At least you have some kind of stable financial support. At least you have father and mother at home. So those are kinds of benefits, and that is the trade-off that we're willing to make in this debate. So some rebuttals that don't fit. Number one, this is not a covert operation by the government and say like no one's going to know, and then one day someone's like Snowden's going to leak it out, and then some national disaster happen. No, it's not like that. We're happy if parents want to tell their kids as early on as in their toddler age, say we changed some things about you, and we think that's okay. We're fine with that. Number two, they said we are taking away access for these people to access their race of, for example, being originally a black person or Hispanic or say a Chinese, for example. And one, I didn't hear a justification of why that is inherently a bad thing, because on the flip side, you're also taking away the access to being a race that could bring you a lot of benefits as well. This is why exactly Vino already told you in his first speech, right? It was entirely arbitrary. No one's taking anything away from you. It's all a birth lottery. So to the best extent of how we're going to make this decision, tangibly, how can we estimate which race or which community, if you are part of, gives you more benefit in the short-term future? That's a perfectly legitimate choice for parents to make. And also, so instead of what we stand for, what we believe in is this, that as long as we get children to be adopted, so for example, like status quo, parents generally like to adopt like younger children. If we're able to change age, for example, we're also happy to do that, because the end goal is at least to give them some tangible, immediate benefits. I'll take you later. So, number one, I try to engage with this idea of racism. It is a problem, and how do we at least help to mitigate that? Number one, we think allowing this policy reduces the sense of rejection that children of ethnic minorities are going to constantly feel and going to constantly be reminded of when they're in orphanages. When you're in an orphanage and you see the majority of kids around you, either blacks or Hispanics, because most of the white kids are all adopted away, that is the sense of bitterness that you instill into these children, that yes, racism is a larger problem that everyone faces in society, but you are the explicit victim of racism because right from the early start of your age, you were already rejected of opportunity right from the start, even if you don't enter the stage of employment discrimination, for example. So that creates a very dark outlook for these children, and we don't think children of that tender age should be subjected to that kind of very, very difficult situations to do with, right? But secondly, we think allowing this policy of changing changing appearance takes away the daily reminder that you are adopted. Suppose you are adopted. A lot of adopted children face this problem is that either one, they constantly feel a sense of isolation from their parents, because every time they wake up in the morning, they look in the mirror, they say, I'm not the real kid of these parents who are taking care of me. My birth parents chose to leave me in the orphanage, and here I am because some people were kind enough to take me. We think those kind of self-conception can be very harmful for people, and especially for young children who find it very difficult and struggle to reconcile the idea that they are adopted and they might not feel as happy as they could be. They also take away the ability for others to constantly remind them that they are adopted. So a lot of cases are like that, right? When you go out with your parents and people give you weird looks because your skin color is different, or people think that you are a domestic helper to these parents, or maybe you're the babysitter. And those are common things that happen in our daily lives that these people, adopted children, have to be constantly subjected to. If there's an avenue for us to take away these kinds of very uncomfortable elements in the growing up process of these children, we are very happy to take away those sticks.
So in the 1950s, white schools in America were forcibly open to black students despite the fact that the prospects for ending racism were remote. And despite the fact that these black kids are being discriminated against. Would you have reversed the course?
No, because there's a tangible benefit of getting education. Just like you're getting a tangible benefit right now of having access to parents who can give you education in future. But generally, in things like, for example, when children have grown up to be adults, and being an ethnic minority, you don't ban them from choosing to have cosmetic surgery if it gives them better opportunity in life, because you cannot use people as social reference to like artificially engineer some kind of change in the future. But the principle is this, that we recognize, yes, there are many children or many parents who can still be very happy even if they look different. But that's something that right now, when we're adopting this child, we have totally no idea and we have no ability to fairly estimate what will happen in the future. In these situations, the most fair thing to do is that parents, in their best ability possible, adjudicate what will be the most comfortable thing for my kid. And that's why, so even if, for example, having a great education or having not having a good education can mean you also can be very happy in life. You can also be a successful person even if you don't get like high school or university education. But that doesn't mean the parents cannot try everything that they can to give the best form of education possible to these children, because right now in their capacity, they think this is the best thing that they could do. So if race is one of those things that can make lives much better for these children, we think it is much, much okay. So the trade-off is this. One, we're okay with not correcting some kind of social norm because at least those children will be adopted. The comparative is this, that racism, if you don't change it in the long term, yes, it can still harm me, say, in the life later on. It can still harm the larger society. But the thing is this, at least right now, if I don't choose or parents are not forced to help or to correct the problem of racism, the comparative is that these children at least get a home. The alternative is these racist parents who never wanted a black kid will never have adopted that black kid anyway, and he will still have to suffer in that orphanage, not having parents, not having financial stability, and all the other things that come with post.
Speaker, the first thing I want to get out of the way is the idea that we still have something to talk about other than race. Adele told you that when you're talking about the newborns, which are specified in this motion, or even like little toddlers, it's very difficult to tell what kinds of facial features or physical features they have in their grow up life. How do you tell, for example, at the age of 2.5 months, 3 months, whether the child is going to have the chiseled cheekbones that you think are so attractive in grown-up young men? You can't tell. Therefore, what Adele told you is that this debate is about racial features because these are the features that are most prominent in newborns. So this debate is about nothing but race. That being said, I want to point out to you, as Adele mentioned, again not rebutted by their side, that their policy is the wet dream of white racists who want to whitewash entire communities and take these individuals out of their houses, as Adele told you, Aboriginal children, for example, the lost children in Australia, and put them into a place where they can be forced to forget their own culture, forced to forget who they were. Their policy enables all this. So I'm going to make a few points in today's speech. The first one is a moral argument about racism and empowering eugenicist rhetoric. The next one I'm going to be talking about this idea about the immediate tangible benefit. No, in fact, I think I'm going to do that first. Then I'm going to be talking about parenthood and relatability and why we don't care if some parents are unable to adopt kids. And last of all, I'm going to be talking a bit more about why we're asking. So first, about this moral argument about actually, no, I'm going to talk first of all about the tangible benefit of adoption, because that's what they've hung their hat on. At the end of the day, at the end of the second proposition speech, what they really say is, we don't care if the parents are racist, etc., because what happens is the child has some tangible benefit here and now because they get parents. Few things I want to point out about this. First, the kinds of parents we are talking about, which are at stake in this debate, are the parents who would not otherwise choose to adopt if the child looked racially different from them. As a result, we think that the parents we're talking about are the parents who are racist themselves. First argument, it is not necessarily better for a child to be brought up in a racist environment, being told constantly that other people of different skin colors are inferior, when that is not good for the child's long-term development. Second, it's not good for the child in the short or the long term, because the parent knows that the child is originally of a different skin color. These kinds of resentments simmer over time and manifest themselves in different ways, even if the parent thinks that they can overcome it. Third reason, they never contested Adil's argument, our policy which gave you, which told you that we don't see the current adoption system as satisfactory either. We're happy to give you all sorts of measures to improve the adoption system, to encourage people to adopt, such that we get more non-racist parents, people who might have been not adopting a status quo because of financial burdens, for example, to adopt as well. The result of this is that we get more adoptions on our side, not contested by them, and these are going to be good parents to the children because they don't think that I need the child to change as a person before I adopt them. Adil additionally told you that we think this concept of relatability is very, very significant because we think that children are little people with their own beliefs, their own desires, and will work to become their own person. The fact that parents now treat under their side these children as being more like equivalent little automatons rolling off a conveyor belt, you can change and mold to suit your own desires of what looks good and what doesn't look good is morally abhorrent for what these children believe in later life. So then I want to talk to you then about the tangible benefit which happens maybe several years down the road, because they try to brush aside this entire thing about the children not knowing, right? They claim that, oh, you can tell or not tell the children. Notwithstanding what Adil already told you about how either telling them or not telling them is morally problematic either way. Because if you don't tell them, the child's likely to find out sooner or later. And at that point, what Adil told you, not responded to again by their side, is the fact that this poisons the relationship between the parent and the child. Even if the parent has genuinely come to love the child questions, why was I brought into this house? They said that increases the relatability of the child to the parent because the child looks in the mirror and says, I look like my parent, therefore everything's okay. That's pretty much actually not true. Children are insecure for a whole host of reasons, and changing their physical appearance and their nose shape and skin color does not do anything to assuage the kinds of problems and the kinds of traumas which these adopted kids go through under your side of the house. You make things worse because even the parents who do love their children now, these children have an additional reason to question whether or not their parents actually love them if it was the case that, well, I might not be adopted if I look different, if I look original. Then they came up with this idea of how racist. I want to talk now a bit about how they set back efforts to fight racism and eugenicist rhetoric, right? But before going, yeah.
The only problem is about us changing things like racial features, be it skin tone or mata setback. If we don't change anything racial related, but just facial features that have nothing to do with racial related, is that a problem for you?
Also, what kinds of features are actually going to be changing which have some sort of relevancy in later life? That provides a single example of the kinds of things your parents will legitimately and practically in the real world want to change. They are not racial features. We told you about the kinds of things which are prevalent and which you can see in newborns. We told you that these are likely to be racial features. Yet to provide us an example of what kinds of things parents are likely to want to change, which have not to do with race because these are prevalent and can be identified in kids. Now I want to talk about eugenicist rhetoric. Adil told you a little bit about how you empower eugenicist rhetoric when you tell and you set that effort to fight racism when you make this thing about race, because you're putting a moral burden on children to change, to fight accusations of racism. We think this is morally problematic. The reason why these kids are disadvantaged in society is not because of anything wrong with them, it's because of things wrong with the rest of us who are racist and treat them wrongly. To put the burden on them to change is victim blaming, is putting cart before the horse, getting things entirely the wrong way around. This is not something we can stand for. Then they came back to us and they said, well, racism is going to happen on either side because on either side the kids in the orphanages are going to be most of the kids in the orphanages are going to be minorities. Yeah, given. We try to solve it. Things are getting better than status quo because interracial adoptions, for example, are getting more and more common over the past couple of years. But more than that, we think things become worse on your side of the house. The kids are given this additional narrative that yes, most of the kids in the orphanage are black or Hispanic or minorities like me. The only way to get out of this adoption agency is to look as white as possible, or as Chinese as possible, or as whatever dominant majority in the country is as possible. We think you empower racist rhetoric far more. So we don't think you stand on that side. That argument stands either. But now I want to talk to you a little bit more about how it leads to whitewashing of communities and its important strategy for racism. Because let's recognize that not every country is as relatively benign as the US, as bad as racism is. There are many countries, many instances in the past couple of decades where racist groups have actually tried to try to find ways to wipe out the culture of groups that they disagree. Imagine what would have happened, for example, if, as you mentioned earlier, the Australian or Canadian governments to try to wipe out Aboriginal culture had access to this type of technology. Imagine the kinds of damage they could do to culture when they create narratives which dislocate children from their original homes, dislocate them from their original culture, and tell them you are better off looking this way for your own good. This denies the agency of the child to pick what kinds of ideas they want to hold, they want to stand for in their life, denies the agency of the child to realize where their origins came from, denies the ability of the child to live a life the way that they want to, because you have made the decision for them. They came up with it, they then said, well, both not true, right? Because either way you look weird. We tell you that it's actually far worse than someone deciding for you what kind of appearance is good for you, and what kind of appearance is good and makes them comfortable, allows them to avoid uncomfortable conversations, than it is to be born unlucky looking a particular way, even if that was the case. On all these grounds, very happy to host.
Switching it off yesterday. Yeah.
Having only 2 fathers and 2 mothers collectively among the 3 of us, we understand what it feels like to experience the loss of a parent. But we also had the privilege of experience the love from a parent. But unfortunately, some orphans can never experience that. Why? Because they never had a chance from the very beginning, be it due to their facial features, skin color, or physical barriers. It's even worse when under your paradigm, because you tell them it's your burden to combat racism. We understand that racism is caused by so many factors out there, but you are our chosen child, you are the chosen one to go out there and fight against racism. We don't think it's an undue burden placed on we think it's an undue burden placed on the children. We think it's the same as Kung Fu Panda, right? We don't think it's his obligation to be the Dragon Warrior without policy, hope, and finally be a duck. 2 issues under these motions. Number 1, what is the child's happiness, and what do their side say anything at all regarding the child's happiness? They drop that ball completely. But secondly, we'll engage them on their best ground, something that they weren't willing to engage with us, on the racial reconciliation in the entire community and how it affects how racial politics play out. But let's move into the first issue immediately, child's happiness. We tell you that more than not, the comparative is this. It's not about this case, for example, getting adopted into a good family, or for example, getting adopted by racist parents, because we contend if your parent is truly that bigoted and that racist, which by the way was an extreme end of the debate anyways, but if they buy the best case scenario and all parents are extremely racist, then why would they even want to adopt a black kid and change it into a white kid in the first place, right? More often than not, they won't go through the hassle and they will just adopt a white kid, right? So we contend that characterization is extremely faulty. We don't think they have extremely KKK members who go out there and have an ulterior motive converting all blacks into white. That simply isn't the debate, right? The debate is about this. Upon immediate understanding that this child, the longer that they spend in childcare center, like what we not told you earlier, the more they internalize the idea that it's because of the appearance that they can never truly find love. It's because that it's not only about opportunities, for example, like finding jobs, it's about the opportunity of even having love and experiencing. That means later on, for example, if they reach, when they reach 18 years old and they have, for example, their own self-autonomy, they will still understand that the reason I'm undergoing these experiences and these feelings are because I was never truly loved and I survived in the orphanage in the very first place. These are things that you can never change in time because they are already experiencing the long time. The beauty about this motion is that we change it from the fact that you're newborn. That means you have no prior knowledge of what experience. We give them the best childhood as we can, and we tell you that even if, for example, it's that racist parent, we believe that the fact that they're willing to change you to give you a better life is one that they are going to raise you in the best way possible. But we believe that the problem that we have with child's happiness does not only end upon adoption. More often than not, a lot of problems are faced when they grow up as well. This is precisely what my previous 2 speakers tell you, right? For example,
we have the adopted child syndrome, which is, for example, understanding and looking in the mirror every day and wondering, why the heck do I look different from my parents? These are things that we can solve. That means, yes, we concede that, for example, when they find out it will be a poisonous relationship between both. But that is a big lock under both sides because it happens anyways, right? The only different and marginal benefit under the other side is it's more convincing now for them to not find out. But even if they find out, they are able to understand that their parents did it out of love and out of a very tangible benefit of providing them a better life and justifying that to them. So we tell you, ultimately, that is the marginal benefit that separates the deadlock between both sides, because if they truly want to find out, then shit will happen, right? But ultimately, it's also about opportunity. What happened right now is we don't use these kids as a bastion. We understand that racism is something that inevitably is caused by a lot of factors, be it, for example, history, be it the way that we're viewing, for example, politics right now. But we don't believe it's a fair burden for states to put onto children to deny them the opportunity to find happiness just because you think there's a more macro level to this idea of racial issues, right? We tell you if you want to solve, and if their idea, which was a concession by the way, they say that their intermarriages are happening far more likely now, it shows that there is already a supplementary trend from mainstream society to move into that direction of reconciliation between race. We don't see how this will necessarily exchange or change the entire direction of where we are heading towards and suddenly revert back to extreme racism between the blacks and the whites. But also, something that I want to point out, which is something that they nitpick on. They say, oh well, when you are upon conception, you can only change certain features such as race. Well, the motion did say assuming it was possible, and in debate 101, if it assumes it was possible, technically we can change everything, be it, for example, changing the genetics, because the motion technically didn't say physical, like plastic surgery, so we can change the genetics to look upon like yourself when you grow up anyways, right? So we say it's very possible, for example, for a parent to choose for that person to have a certain height, or for example, for disabled parents, maybe if they really want to do so, to make, for example, allow the children to look upon themselves in order to ensure a better relationship. We tell you that the trade-off is this. Under their side, kids will continue staying in adoption centers. The ultimate comparative between both sides that you must understand is whose side gets these children out of these traumatic experiences. We tell you it's only our side when we remove the standard of barrier for these children to even get adopted in the first place, and that's what we provided to you under our side. But let's look at the second idea, on the idea of racial reconciliation. We tell you from the, okay, go.
So in a world in which gay conversion therapy was proven to work, would you send your gay kid to therapy?
We tell you that if it didn't affect the opportunity of this child finding happiness or it's the best interest of the child, why not, right? We tell you the motion is about the child, which is something that you have never actually contended under your side. So we tell you if it's the best way, and to live in an extremely homophobic society where the only opportunity for this kid to grow up is to be straight, then why not, right? We think the parents are acting in the best interest, which is basically what Deborah told you. Everything from your education to your religion is based on what the parents think is the best for you, and we tell you that that is the best for parenthood that you can have on our side. Let's look at the idea of racial reconciliation. They say that more often than not, we are, for example, changing and whitewashing the entire narrative. But if I recall correctly, the motion necessarily means only newborn adoption, right? That means the only society or the only community that we're adopting is adoption. That means, for example, black parents will still give birth to black kids, and Hispanic parents will still give birth to Hispanic kids, right? That means, for example, there's still not entirely whitewashing because it only affects, number one, a niche community, and number two is about this community, right? So after all, you can still see, for example, us allowing these Hispanic and African American kids the chance to go to school, and that's precisely why we don't necessarily change and skew the entire perception of how we're progressing now. The ultimate trade-off is this. Under their side, they keep saying that we want to use this kid as, for example, tools in order for us to fight for greater good. But there's no tangible outcome under their side. They have no comparative whatsoever to tell us how are they better doing this in the future, or how are they, for example, combating racism under their side. The only thing they say is we will get kids out of adoption. How? By having tax breaks, right? And they say that they are very good parents. If we tell you that your kids are actually, your parents are only adopting you because they want to get tax breaks, we contend on whether or not these parents are actually very good parents. But beyond that, right, we tell you, ultimately, the debate is about this. We don't exclude the kid from a certain race or certain community because, like I asked my POI, this oppression will happen regardless on both sides. The only difference is whose side provide that children the opportunity to prevent that from even happening. Yes, it might lead to some whitewashing under our side, but it's more a bullet that we're willing to take because as long as we ensure that that child gets happiness, that's the burden we're willing to take. We're very proud of the folks.
The identity you are born with is of some value to you. And the side that truly makes a tool out of the child is the side that goes like this. My ability to parent, my willingness to parent is contingent on my child looking just like me. And therefore, I will change the child because the child is nothing more than an instrument of my selfish desire, my fixation of becoming a parent, my innate yearning, right, for someone who looks like me, who looks up to me and worships me because I'm like him. This is megalomania. We don't think megalomania is suitable, right, for the psychology of wannabe adoptive parents. So two main areas in this debate, right? Firstly, will these children have better lives? And secondly, the wider social consequences, which they are trying to neglect throughout this debate. On the first, will these children have better lives? Down Proposition Bench, what they told us was this. It is of the greatest importance that these children find foster families because there are benefits within foster families that are so important, that are irreplaceable, they cannot get through any other means possible. So getting children into foster families was their categorical imperative right from the get-go. But we contend that a foster family isn't a be-all and end-all, right? Life in the orphanage isn't hell, right? You have people who take care of you. You have a school, right, to go to while you're in an orphanage, right? We don't think that every single foster family you enter is always better, right, than the orphanage, life you live in the orphanage, right? And we think that the kind of parents that you get adopting children on their side of the house will lead to the kind of unhappy families and foster family relations that we describe on our side of the house. Because recognize this, the point at which the characterization coming from us is that these parents would not have adopted the children otherwise, right? They wouldn't have wanted to adopt these children because they look racially different from them. We think at this point, right, the parent is fixated not on the child itself, right? Prime Minister has gone and worked in an adoption center. He knows, right, the magic of the moment when a parent looks at a child and goes like, regardless of whether he's black, white, Hispanic, Latino, whatever, I have an attachment to this child and I will adopt this child because of that instinctual connection, right? And the instinctual connection is neglected. It becomes of secondary importance, right? The point at which you go like this, I'm only adopting you because of certain contingent external characteristics that arise from this, that arise and are of concern to me, right? We think that unconditional love stops actually mattering in this whole process. And unconditional love actually matters a great deal for several reasons, right? Because in the process of parenting, a lot of things like don't work out the way you expect it to work out in the very first place. Imperfections in the children arise, and right? And when the adoptive parent was originally fixated on the idea of the child's appearance, what happens is that you cannot transfer this to you cannot transfer your love in the very same way possible, right? So what happens is that the adoption process gets screwed up, and you get parents which are actively bad for these children, adopting these children to begin with, right? And secondly, we told you, right, that when these children find out, it's not a matter of if, right? We think many of these children will find out because there's no such thing as a perfect life, right? We think that the same way that parents cannot hide the fact of adoption from their children, right? The thing is, children will find out, right, when they inherit the parents, was I racially transformed as a result of you adopting me? We think that these are things which lead to active mistrust and animosity within the family, right? Because your parent now no longer loves you for who you were, right? Who you were born as, and that kind of like, and that birth identity is extremely important, right? Because people seek out their birth parents, right? It's something that they actually go to long lengths for, right? Your birth identity matters to you. And therefore we think that this kind of animosity arises. We think these children actually have worse lives, right? As a result of what goes on, right? So, understanding this, right, let's move. Also, we brought to you also the idea of treating the child as a blank slate, right? Recognize on their side of the house that nothing in the child's original genetic makeup is of any intrinsic importance whatsoever. They're perfectly happy to change everything about this child, right? They're happy to change whatever, insofar as the child now fits in. But this completely neglects the fact, right, that the principle of local parentis has us trust, right, that the parents are only holding the rights of the child in temporary abeyance so that the parents are facilitator for the growth of the child, right? The child is not merely a Barbie doll, right, which you change the looks of, you put makeup on, and all of these things. There's far more to being a parent than simply being, there's far more to being a parent than like having the child look like you and bringing up the child well simply because he looks like you, right? So now on to the wider social consequences, right? And this is a huge part of this debate, right? Because all they talked about was the benefit of the orphan, the benefit that accrues to the individual. Recognize that they're employing and they're buying into the entire idea of systematic racial discrimination down the whole line. What happens as a result of that policy is that a racial hierarchy is established, right? Recognize that firstly, right, the first harm, right, stigma against interracial families, right? Because what happens is that there are presently interracial families where the parent has already adopted children of a different race. But what they're going to tell us, right, is in their society, right, the norm is that if you're of a certain race, you don't adopt children of a different race, right? If you do choose to adopt these children, you change their looks because this is something they simply do, right? It's normalized behavior unless they're at the house, right? So we think that you hurt other families, right? Because what they appear as now is simply an aberration and distinct from others. Compare this to outside the house, right? Where I told you there's a linear, progressive trend, right? Moving towards greater acceptance of interracial families down the line, right? This is something that's beneficial, right? But before I move on, yes, sir.
The older orphans in the orphanage, honestly, would do anything to get a family. Let's say if they are okay.
Yeah. Okay. So the older orphans in the orphanage, right? You would have them go through transracial surgery simply to get a foster parent. We think that this is incredibly racist, right? This reminds you of the kind of ethnic cleansing that the Australian government inflicted on the Aborigine community, right? The lost generation policy. When people are forcibly taken out of our families, right? Or orphans taken out of families, actively whitewashed. Part of that policy, right, agents, right? In the orphanages, you will actively whitewash and change to a certain mode so that you will get adopted by white families and subsequently forget Aboriginal heritage. This is systematic racism, gets an entire class of people. It relegates them to being second class, right? Because what happens at an orphanage is a signal of what race means in wider society. That if you're of a certain race, you mean less, right? People are less likely to want to adopt you. And all of these are incredibly pernicious effects, right? It's a racial hierarchy that actually hurts, the idea of purity within the family permeates into wider society. And we think this is mana for racists and white supremacists everywhere who want nothing more, right, than to whitewash the societies. So with concession coming out of third prop, right, that this might lead to self-whitewashing. It's actually far more pernicious in effect, right? Because we think that this hurts black families, black children, and interracial families everywhere. For all these reasons, we don't think it benefits the children. We think it hurts society at large. Go to the side of opposition.
Yeah.
Being Malay, Singapore is talking about what it's like to be discriminated against based on what you look like and based on who you are. And I think being Chinese in this country has also taught a lot of people what it's like to be discriminated against based on who you are and what you look like. Being black in America has taught people the same thing. Which is why I'm fucking sad. It's a very, very sad world that people ignore the fact that while we do acknowledge, there are people whose interests we want to take care of. There are children who are waiting to be adopted, and we feel for them. There are ultimately far bigger things out there that matter. There are far bigger imperatives that we need to take care of. Because for every child who's stuck in an orphanage, there are 1,000 more children who are part of minorities in these countries who are being discriminated against every single day of their lives. And that's not something that we can stand for. And even if we don't talk about race, if you talk about changing children's appearances because they look ugly or because they don't match their appearances to their parents, if you talk about enforcing certain beauty standards, certain standards of what it means to look normal, like in countries, in Korea or South Korea, where plastic surgery is rampant, for instance, look, these are not the sorts of things we want to encourage. It destroys children and it destroys communities. So the question I have then is, whose lives are at stake? As I've already told you, right? Yeah, there are people. There are children in orphanages who need to be adopted, and we acknowledge that, don't get me wrong, right? But there are also many people, many children and minorities who live within majority white communities, for example, who are already being discriminated against, and who don't need another way for white parents to tell their neighbors and their kids that, look, we don't really want black children in our households, in our neighborhoods, and that's why we are willing to even whitewash the children we adopt in order to ensure that we have a racially pure household. And this is the most progressive of societies, like in America, mind you. If you want to talk about societies which are not so progressive, like you would imagine Australia is a progressive place, but Canada is a progressive place. But the fact that they were capable of such chicanery several decades ago suggests that even these countries are pretty screwed up. And then you talk about the countries which are not so benevolent, You talk about China and the Han-Chinese, for example, and how they would really love to exterminate their racial minorities out, one way or another. These are the sort of things that could happen. We talk to you about all of these things, but all of these things would ignore as if they didn't exist, or as if that we were just trying to push shit out of our ass, but we're not pulling shit out of our ass. These are the sort of people whose lives are at stake. These are the sort of people who are being discriminated every single day because they've been excluded from their houses, their neighborhoods, their communities, their cities. And these are the sort of people whom we are going to destroy in the long term. I understand it's difficult to take care of adopted children. I understand our policy is not perfect. But look at the bigger picture. We need to heal communities, we need to heal countries. And at the point at which you allow for racist rhetoric in which you can change the racial appearance of your children, I am sorry, but that's not something we can countenance. You may think that there are some parents who are well-meaning out there who really want to change the racial appearance of their children for their own good. Fine. But the majority of people are not that way. And even if you could find such parents who are like this, the wider community is going to interpret things in a very different manner. Last question. Can we take better care of our orphan kids? Yes. We acknowledge adoption systems are not perfect. We acknowledge that better checks have to be made, more resources need to be pumped in the same way social welfare systems in general need more resources. We acknowledge the fact that we need to encourage adoption through tax rates, right? Even Singapore has tax rates for kids, for parents not to adopt kids, but to have kids in the first place. Not because we don't give a fuck about kids, but because it's fucking expensive to raise one. And we want to give the child the best life he or she could have. And that's why our policy does work. It will not work perfectly, but it will work enough to ensure that a fair number of kids can be adopted into these households, but not at the expense of committing a far greater sin, a far greater evil. And if I were to be one such parent who wanted to change the racial appearance of my adopted child, hell, I would have to go before God and explain to him why the fuck I don't judge people based on who they are, but based on what they look like when they were born.
I'll talk about three things. I'll talk about my mom, then I'll talk about World Debating Championship, and then I'll compare these two things. Number one, my mother. She's a religious racist. In fact, when she looks at my pictures on Facebook with Vinod and Sharon, she calls me and says, "Hey, why you keep taking pictures with these Indians and Malays? You need to stop taking pictures with them." And she's a flawed human being, just like anyone else. And in fact, like a lot of parents that they characterize, she hopes that I one day become a religious leader in church and help like lead people to like reconciliation with God. But despite being imperfect, I still think she was a hero to me. Just like a lot of parents all around the world, despite being imperfect, or despite being racist, despite being very flawed, are still heroes to their children. And they still can do a pretty good job, right? Because that's what people generally can do. They are still able to at least provide you economic stability, provide you education, provide you some kind of comfort when you're bullied at school, when you come back. And those are the things, that the benefits that they never really wanted to comprehend, how much it affects the child, especially children at a very tender young age. And that's something we're not willing to trade off for a lot of things. Secondly, let's talk about Worlds. When we went to Worlds last year, it was the epitome of racism, right? So like racism. So like when you go to a lot of rounds and then you feel like you're discriminated because you're an Asian team. And these kind of things are constantly being debated and discussed throughout the debating community. And despite all the effort that we put in, nothing much is being changed. And when you look at racism as a problem, as decades, right? We as human race have been trying to solve. We proposed policies, we have reforms, we even took up arms and went to the Civil War in name of race and racial equality. But despite all that effort, we are still having racism as a problem today. They're telling us that this burden of reducing or mitigating racism has to fall on the burdens of children and orphans currently in orphanages, waiting to be adopted, waiting to have a family. We think if you need to do that trade-off, at least you have to show us that it will be worth it. That maybe there will be some kind of tangible benefit. At least you can try to quantify to us how much difference that it does it make if these children, whether their racial features change or not. If they cannot quantify to us that this trade-off is worth it, then we think it's not worth it, right? So comparing these two things, we recognize that either ways, these choice and this debate never considers what the children think or what their opinions are anyway, because either way you're going to either impose a new identity or take away their chance to be adopted. So when we are trying to make a change or we are trying to make that decision, it has to be what's measurable, what we can directly see. The comfort of the recognition and the satisfaction of having someone to love you and knowing that you are accepted. For example, not being constantly bullied in school because you are adopted. Those are comforts that are immeasurable. Compare that to some vague, ambiguous satisfaction that you know in future, I wasn't complicit in part of making racial tension the biggest problem. We don't think that comparison measures up. Ultimately, if I was to be racially discriminated in debate competitions, for example, at least I can go home to my mom and tell her about my problems. I think that is the kind of comfort that gives me the courage to really, if you want to solve racial problems in future, then you can go on and be an activist and do all that you want. Like maybe even people like Martin Luther King wanted to go home to have good parents that were able to send him to school, that made him know how to learn to speak and to give a speech of I have a dream. And all those things are important because those things come first before you're able to move on to greater things like generating social change. Propose.
Okay.